Hello and welcome back to the UAAA and Griffin podcast. We are Kevin, Christian, Griffin, and Tyler. Today we'll be talking about how the rise of industry during the Gilded Age brought both greater opportunities and greater restrictions for marginalized groups like immigrants, minorities, and women. The idea of the survival of the fittest was popular during the Gilded Age, describing how the weak or the poor and marginalized die out and the fit or the rich survive. During this time, Horatio Alger wrote novels about poor boys and their rise from humble backgrounds to lives of comfort through good work. These self-made men and the rags to riches stories, as they came to be known, were sometimes associated with the likes of Andrew Carnegie, a powerful businessman who went from being a poor Scottish immigrant to being the captain of the industry. While Carnegie was an immigrant and rose to such power, stories like this among the immigrant women and minority communities were exceedingly rare. Carnegie was the exception, not the rule. In reality, these groups were kept down by big business, especially as corrupt businesses set high prices to exploit them.
What experiences did minorities go through during the Gilded Age?
There were many people who were put at a disadvantage during this time, one of these being minorities. After the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, African Americans continued to suffer from racism and all sorts of segregation. After the Reconstruction era, Jim Crow laws were prevalent in the country up until the 1950s. These laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities. Many of these laws were in place to prevent African Americans from doing things that they were allowed to do. One of these were the literacy tests, in which one would have to pass a reading test or writing test in order to vote. Many African Americans could not pass this because their whole life they lacked the education they needed to be able to learn this when they were slaves. Another one was the grandfather clause, in which if your older relatives were unable to vote prior to the 15th Amendment, then you, their descendant, would also be exempt from voting. This affected many African Americans later on because most of their relatives were former slaves and lived during the time where they were being mistreated. Along with education, many also lacked the money in order to pay these poll taxes, which you had to pay in order to vote.
These Jim Crow laws, however, were not the only thing that limited African Americans. There were many Supreme Court cases that supported the idea of segregation and unfair treatment of these minorities. The civil rights cases of 1883 were five landmark cases in which the Supreme Court held that the 13th and 14th Amendments did not empower Congress to outlaw racial discrimination by private individuals, meaning the federal government could not order or force segregation, but places like restaurants, hotels, or other businesses could. Another case was the Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine, meaning both whites and blacks were equal, but they had to be separated.
Like we mentioned earlier, since African Americans usually could not afford the poll taxes at elections because they lacked the financial freedom, this led to the economic discrimination that they faced. This meant that people of the lower class, in this situation African Americans, could not be able to get or do certain things that the rich could. This could have been many things like lower wages, more working hours, and worse positions. They also struggled to gain any political power. This was because of the rules in the South for white primaries where only white voters were permitted to vote or become juries. It made their voices unheard and unable to bring the change that they had sought out for. There were lots of different people who tried to bring change on their own and implement new ideas. One of these people was W.E.B. Du Bois. His idea was to obtain an education and be a contribution to the economy. While also striving to get political and societal rights at the same time, others had crazier ideas like recolonization in Liberia of Africa.
On top of all the segregation and laws that suppressed African Americans, they also dealt with lynch mobs who did not support any type of freedom for them and hated to see them do things that they were not able to before. These white supremacists would find awful ways to punish or mistreat African Americans, like gathering up in mobs and lynching any black person that they found. Eventually, African Americans realized the problem with living in the South and moved to other places of the country, where it was more industrialist and less labor-intensive, like the agricultural life they were used to. From the 1910s to the 1970s, we see the African American migration. This was one of the largest movements of people in the country's history. Approximately 6 million African Americans moved from the south of the country to the north, Midwestern, and Western states. They did this because they wanted a new life that was more industrialized and to start living more freely. Once there, they settled into ethnic neighborhoods. These were neighborhoods in which people of the same race or ethnicity would settle together. This was their only way of preserving their culture or being who they were. This was the only way of preserving their culture or being who they were without losing a sense of character.
What was immigration like during the Gilded Age?
Well, the era of the old immigrants, or immigrants who came to the US before the 1880s from Northern and Western Europe, was over, as many immigrants now came from places like Eastern and Southern Europe. These groups were called the new immigrants. Many of these immigrants wanted to come to America to seek better opportunities and a better life, escaping persecution and poverty. They would enter the country through New York City. The Statue of Liberty loomed above New York Harbor as these immigrants arrived, serving as a beacon of hope and freedom. They would arrive on nearby Ellis Island, an immigrant receiving station that opened in 1892, where immigrants would be given a medical examination and only allowed in if they were healthy. However, it wasn't just smooth sailing for these immigrants after arriving, as there had actually been many restrictions placed on immigrants before Ellis Island even opened its doors. For example, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1882, which placed restrictions on the immigrants of so-called undesirable persons, such as paupers, criminals, convicts, and the mentally incompetent. It also levied a head tax of 50 cents on each new immigrant. Another law was the Contract Labor Act, passed in 1885, which restricted the immigration of temporary workers. The intention was that this would protect and prioritize American workers. The nativist sentiment that emerged during the political crisis of the 1850s was also still strong, as the American Protective Association, a nativist organization, was created in 1887. Its main goal was to campaign for laws to restrict immigration.
Europeans weren't the only ones coming to America, though, as during the Gilded Age, we see the first Asian immigrants coming to the West Coast. While European immigrants entered the country through Ellis Island in New York Harbor, Asian immigrants went through Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. The arrival of these new immigrants sparked fierce white supremacist settlement, with many calling their arrival the Yellow Terror. This fear of Asian immigrants caused much discrimination, and later the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was meant to curb Chinese immigration during the United States, especially in California. For 10 years, Chinese immigrants were declared to be ineligible for naturalization.
We also see the political exploitation of immigrants during the Gilded Age. We once again return to Tammany Hall, the big Democratic political machine in New York City. Immigrants were a massive voter base that needed to be absorbed by either party, and Tammany Hall tried its best to secure all the immigrant votes, and maybe multiply the total by 2 or 3 for good measure. We see scenes of immigrants being loaded off of boats and being paid to vote, Tammany and immigrants being shaved so that they would look different and be able to vote again and again.
Some would argue that America truly emerges as a melting pot of different cultures at this time. But to some historians, this term implies that they abandoned their old cultures and assimilated into the broader American culture. These historians argue that first-generation immigrants maintained their identity, and only the second and third generations were assimilated in the U.S. society.
What kind of improvements were made for women during this time period?
Well, we see many women pushing in the women's rights movements. Some of these famous names you have probably heard before, such as Susan B. Anthony, Jane Addams, and Frances Willard. Jane Addams was an American activist who won the Peace Prize and was an important leader in the women's suffrage movement. Willard was an American temperance reformer and women's suffragist. She became the national president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879 and even founded WCTU, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is an international temperance organization and was one of the first organizations of women dedicated to social reforms. Susan B. Anthony was an American social reformer and women's rights activist who was incredibly important in the women's suffrage movement. She was one of the founders of NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was an organization created in the United States to advocate for women's suffrage and rights. Thank you for listening to this episode of the UAAA and Griffin podcast. We are Kevin, Christian, Griffin, and Tyler. Thank you.